right now. So just to introduce myself, because you all have been hearing a lot about me, I am Vashti Maharaj, the advisor on digital trade, and I work with the TUNR team at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So without more, I'm going to move into the presentation this afternoon on data protection and cross-border data flows. For just my presentation, I have a question. Everyone has their phone or laptop with them? Show me by the raise of hands, because I'll need for you all to show me proof of life for the point of my presentation. It's very, very important. So without more, part of the digital economy, and as it comes to trade, as we move to the element of trade, you're going to find that cross-border trade, it refers to the movement of personal data from one country to the other and across international borders. And that is basically the crux of digital trade. Trade in this digital age, including not e-commerce, because that's now digital economy, as the Attorney General has pointed out, that's superannuated. It demands seamless cross-border exchange of data in order to move goods and cargo and even services across the globe, of which the Caribbean is a very integral part. The rapid advances in digitalization means that we have a lot of technology tools at our hands. We have AI, machine learning, cloud computing, robotics, and it therefore means that as part of this trade value chain, there's more and more and more data that is generated. Because do you know that the more developed a country is and the younger its population, the more data is produced? And you find that particularly in the aftermath of the global pandemic, even if you had an aversion to shopping online, it now became your mainstay. So in light of that, businesses have an increased reliance on cross-border exchange of personal data to develop and sell new products. When you buy something, even when companies purchase things, from beginning to end, it involves the mass movement of personal data across that value chain to allow for a transaction to be completed. This naturally has led to a lot of data, and I know we all talk about big data and using big data for good, but we're looking at it in the context of global trade and how that can be harnessed and how member states within the Caribbean are actually dealing with cross-border data flows. Do you think we're dealing with it really well? Oh, well, there you go. So it means that it's not just a game changer for the large companies, but particularly during the pandemic, you would have found that smaller companies as SMEs are able to overcome informational disadvantages and reduce barriers by enhancing or taking advantage of data analytics and using data within their business. But you find that in light of this, and I can say this as a career person with a legal background, you'd find that the legislation always follows technology. We're never in front, we're always behind. And when it comes to trade and the increasing volume of trade across international borders, it is a question to ask, what has been the government's reaction? Have our laws in relation to cross-border data flows also been kept up to date? Have we been able to keep abreast and sufficiently enhance and harness this trend within the Caribbean? And the answer is that there are lots of concerns, and I'm not going to preempt the wonderful discussions that are going to take place by my colleague in relation to fair competition and consumer protection, as well as cyber. But the cross-border data transfer, in as much as it's the lifeblood of digital trade, because you can't buy anything online without entering your data, it has given rise to concerns about the effects of information being collected and used, often without the knowledge of data subjects. So that being said, there have been issues, and I'm sure all of you are all too familiar with these issues within your everyday interactions within your businesses and governments, relating to privacy and personal data protection, access to information for audit purposes, national security, and how to develop domestic digital industries while still creating a liberalized environment for data flows. So within the Caribbean, data protection laws present a varying degree of restrictiveness. So when I say a varying degree of restrictiveness, when we look at cross-border data flows, a country itself can take a policy position as to how it's going to deal with data that comes in, that is generated in its borders, and leaves its borders. Some countries take a very protectionist view. Some countries are like, let it flow. We want to encourage businesses to, have access to data, and we want to encourage big data and AI, data-driven sort of industry. And then you have countries that are insistent on data localization, and we must know everything that is happening because this is our data and this is our gold, and we have to mine it first, or use it, or control it. So that being said, we're just going to do an overview of what are the different approaches that you can take and generally are taken across the board internationally. You would see from this diagram, there's no regulation, and you'd be pleased to know that the Caribbean has not been left behind. There is still no regulation in some jurisdictions. And free flow is where there may be no regulation or there's regulation and it does not speak to cross-border data transfers. And in my analysis of the Caribbean legislation, which we'll get to very shortly, you will find that some of the data protection legislation is very nascent. It's been there in the books since very early 2000s, when we were now addressing data protection and its need to protect the data, but it is now 2022. And they may not have contemplated down the road how important the element of cross-border data flow would have been with regard to trade and commerce within the Caribbean. So they may have been silent on that, and therefore they will fall under free flow. Then there's the flow of data on conditional safeguards. And conditional safeguards vary across the Caribbean and internationally. Those safeguards could mean that the other country has to have equivalent laws, or those safeguards may be that the person has to consent for their data to leave the jurisdiction, or it may be that there must be contractual guarantees that allow for that data to move. You must consent to it. And the liability is passed on to who is sending the data out, interestingly enough, which we will get to just now. And then there is the ultimate, which is flow conditional and ad hoc authorization. It is the most restrictive form that you can take, and believe it or not, some countries in the world take this approach and advocate this approach because they indicate that this provides the best level of confidence and trust by private sector entities. At the end of the day, it is always a national policy decision that needs to be taken as to what is the best fit for your jurisdiction. And in looking at the Caribbean, you will find that clearly that's happening, because we have a speckled, varying approach with regard to cross-border data flows. So on the free flow, it is just that, free flow. It is the least restrictive. And this also pertains to countries that have no specific data protection laws. While this implies that there are no restrictions on movement of data, this is actually more of a curse and a blessing sometimes when it comes to global international trade. And I'm sure you can guess the reason why. The reason why is that the absence of regulation precludes the willingness of other countries that have legislation to send their data to you, because they're not too sure what will happen to that personal information or transactional data when it is your can be a barrier to cross-border data flows. On the second one, which is conditional safeguard, and this is like the middle, this is like towing the middle here, where you have a Data Protection Act, you have something in place that says, okay, we understand that data is going to leave our country, but it can only leave under these specific conditions. And these safeguards include the requirement that the laws up, and in many instances, you will find that this requires an equivalency determination by your regulator, which is your information commissioner. How many of your countries have an information commissioner instituted? Can you show me by the raise of hands? That's 1, 2. What country would that be? Can we get a round of applause for Barbados? Yay! Cayman Islands is in the room. I think they have theirs. Bermuda has theirs. Jamaica has theirs. So in many instances, your information commissioner plays a very integral role if you have flow conditional and safeguards, because they will need to make an equivalency determination. They will do an analysis or assessment and say this country has equivalent protections and therefore they have an adequacy assessment and they will authorize the flow of data, which is very important. Do you want to know a fun fact about the Caribbean? A lot of jurisdictions, when I put up my table, because I spent a whole night reading all your laws, a lot of the countries provide for an information commissioner's office, an ombudsman's office, or a tribunal even. So it's there. Do you know how many have set up their offices? And it is questionable, because what happens if it is that you have the legislation that provides for flow conditional and safeguards? So you're allowed to move your data out, but your information commissioner has to give you an adequacy assessment, and you don't have an information commissioner. Does that put you back onto open access? It's a very interesting thought, because at the end of the day, you're saying your country's legislation allows for cross-border data flows because we're big on trade and we're like winning it. But in reality, if you don't put in place the necessary provisions that is provided in your legislation, you actually put yourself at a back foot, back to the first position, which is free flow, technically. And that affects multinational trading, because multinational companies such as the big ones, the big tech companies, they have to comply with GDPR regulations, and they need adequacy in the countries that they're trading with. So by having the legislation, that's one step. But putting in place the protections is what they actually need to show in order to let that data come to your jurisdiction. It's a very important fact to note. So flow conditional and ad hoc authorization is like the upper end. That's the highest end of restriction where, and you find, believe it or not, a lot of countries, when I was doing my assessment of COMESA member states, some of them actually take this approach. But because they operate as a trading bloc and have similar provisions, it does not preclude global trade. It actually enhances it. And this is a food for thought. And not just in what is the best model, but what is the best model that will work for your region. Because no country is a standalone country when it comes to data flows. You have to think of where the data is flowing to. What do they have in place? Will it bounce back like a force field because they can't accept it? This is all part of our Caribbean discourse that we need to take in mind. When it comes to data protection and the movement of information, know that you cannot draft your country's laws in a vacuum or within a silo. You have to think of your trading partners and what's the impact upon the economy of the data protection law. So back to Egypt. So this is the most, I would say, stringent, where an adequacy finding is required by the relevant public authority, and where it is not granted, it's not possible to transfer data. Given the time and cost to obtain permission from the government authority, such laws are more restrictive to cross-border data movement. However, firms might feel comfortable to transfer data only where there's prior approval by the government, making cross-border trade thrive under the most restrictive laws, but that is within the context of the regional trading bloc. That being said, everybody, this is your time to shine and give me feedback. I've been talking to you all about data protection and what it can do for you. So I'd like you to get on your phone or your laptop and go to menti.com and use this code. And IT, if you can put up the presentation screen. So the question is, what do you think is the most widely used model for cross-border data flows in the Caribbean? What do you think we use across the Caribbean? Is it free flow, conditional on safeguards, or conditional with ad hoc authorization? You are the people. These are your laws. Oh, free flow. Interesting.
On paper or in reality?
On paper. But in reality, good question. So come on, let's go. I know how much of you all in the room. I know how much of you all are online. I know some of you all are lawyers. Let's stop pretending we're not. All right. A lot of people think we're free flow just because it's carnival season. All right. Okay. Interesting. Nobody thinks about flow conditional ad hoc. All right, there's one person. All right, that's interesting. You know, I should have walked with my bag of chocolates for the right answer. Tomorrow it is Valentine's. All right, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Any more takers? Let's see who got it right. Because I actually did my research last night. I have the right answer. I have the right answer. Okay. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds for those who haven't to complete. Is this your last answer? Last call. And so you think, and from these answers, the most widely used model for cross-border data flows in the Caribbean would be flow conditional and safeguards. Is this your final answer? All right, for the money, let's go back to my presentation, see if you're right. And the answer is flow with safeguards. Yay! Give yourself a round of applause. So what happens is that this is a snapshot of the data protection legislation, but just the provisions that relate to cross-border flow of information. And I will tell you something about doing this research. It was not just about free flow is for the ones that don't have the legislation, but you found that flow with safeguards was a very tricky category because no one country had the same clause or provision. Some of them had different requirements, and even some of them had a mix of flow with safeguards, but still the information commissioner has to say yes. Now imagine being a trading partner with the Caribbean. Would you be fairly confused at this point in time? I just want to trade with the entire Caribbean, and I need your information, and I need to have some sort of uniformity to understand how to navigate this Caribbean market. So this is a very telling tale about where we're at for Caribbean group with regard to cross-border data flows. And though cross-border data transfer regulatory objectives are not meant to regulate international trade, they have substantial unintended trade consequences, especially when they restrict the movement of data that is critical for the coordination of global value chains. And you would also find that heterogeneity, where you have a mixed bag of data protection regulation. So if I want to do business with the Caribbean, I have to figure out what each jurisdiction has as a requirement, because it's not one and the same. Heterogeneity and restrictiveness and the absence of regulation laws in some Caribbean states create uncertainty in regional data flows. And regional harmonization of data flow regulations I'm not saying that that's the panacea, because the truth is it's easier said than done. Come on, Caribbean, we know this. But what happens is that I'm not advocating that we all need to regionally harmonize our laws and it needs to be the same. What you find is that studies in other jurisdictions have shown that it tends to reduce compliance costs and boost in regional trade, and there's a positive nexus between international cross-border data flow agreements, both in trade in goods and services. So what's the takeaway? As I said, I'm going to be the shortest and hopefully the best presentation for today. So what is our takeaway? What do we come away thinking? And this presentation is very short because it's cross-cutting with the discussion on Caribbean harmonization tomorrow, on standards, as well as cybersecurity. So I'm just actually putting it out there for you to think and take away and come back with more questions. There's no one size fits all, as the Honorable Attorney General for Barbados said this morning. There isn't one answer, and you can't expect everyone to come up with the same laws. It is based on your economic circumstances. What is your national policy directive that influences your laws? However, there are many gains. You don't have to go for harmonization. You could go for the quick wins. And my colleagues tomorrow will speak about the importance of standardization, which is another level that is equally important. There are many gains that can be derived from adopting common principles and standards in the development of your legal framework. It doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be sufficiently wide to allow for that regional and international trade to be conducive. And also, one of the other things we observed in our work across the Commonwealth jurisdictions is that in addition to your data protection laws, legal frameworks can be supplemented by mutual regional agreements. And as a Caribbean, we are very well poised to take advantage of that situation, because when you have MRAs, it's easier to allow for data flows because there's agreements between governments as to how this will occur. And this is certainly an avenue that can be maximized within the CARICOM region as a whole. So on that note, that's the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be quite happy to take them now. If not, I'd be happy to move on to the next presentation too. Any questions? Yes, Chris.
That was a really interesting diagram you had with all the different legal systems all lined up. I mean, what does success look like? Are we all, I say we, but I mean, is everybody meant to be in the left-hand side?
Success looks like everybody has something in place in the first instance.
Yeah.
But I think greater success would be where what we have in place is in alignment. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing, but there's a common principled basis or common standards. So when you deal with the Caribbean as a whole, your data is not going to stop from one country to the other, but you can have the seamless movement, because within a globalized trade environment, that is what is required. And the economic gains that can be derived from that, as my senior director had pointed out very early this morning when we were all fresh and had our coffee, was that, the added value of legal reform to allow for frameworks to allow for cross-border trade can accrue great economic benefits across the Commonwealth, 1.3 trillion by 2030. All right, yes.
This one is working. You'll hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vashti. I just want to comment on something that Vashti was talking about with the harmonization, and even in her other place, when she was in the office of the Attorney General back home by us, when we were working on data protection legislation and so forth, you would find that Trinidad and Tobago, our CPC department, will work a lot with other regional countries to look at harmonization of our legislation so that when it's time for enforcement, we're not bouncing and bumping heads with each other on from policy come straight into legislation. So, and I know sometimes that's a little bit of a ticklish situation when your law says something else and then ours says, and we do something else. So when Vashti speaks to harmonization and she was answering Chris just now, I think that having that balance within our region helps us to move forward together in data sharing, especially too when it comes to mutual legal assistance.
Yes.
And yes, the NRA, as you spoke about. Well done, Vashti.
Thank you. Divya, please no hard questions now.
Nope. I want to toot my own horn. So I'm representing CARICOM, Competition Commission, and we are one agency under the wider revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which alleges to bring together certain member states of the Caribbean. And it is alleging that it wants to promote economic integration. We are facing global economies. We have less than 6 or 7 million in the Caribbean as a whole. So when Vashti says 1.3 trillion in the Commonwealth, as a Caribbean, we are literally a little teeny tiny bird flying in a big wide sea. So when it comes to data, and when she says that the youngest group creates most of the data, yes, even last week I was on a website and it asked me my birthday, and over 20 years legal experience, and guess what? I just put in my birth date, and afterwards I'm sitting down like, did I really need this article so bad? But this is what we're facing. There are cross-border flows and it directly impacts trade. Individually, we are unable to trade. And well, in my own discussion, you will see the competition issues, but when we talk about regionalization, we do need, through CCC, through CTU, and through the CARICOM Secretariat, to sit down and start seriously having discussions on this aspect so that we have a game plan for the region. So even though our legislation may not be filled with sameness, we have a certain comparability and reciprocity that other trading blocs will meet and enjoy, and likewise, so will we when we go into multilateral negotiations. So I think that is just the one thing, Vashti, that I wanted to bring out from my side, that yes, we can have individual pieces of legislation, but if our pieces of legislation come together because it is tied to something in the RTC or another protocol that we have all agreed, we have more weight on the international arena to demand rights for our own consumers, our own businesses, and our own sovereign nations. So that's it. Thank you, and thank you for a very entertaining and educational presentation.
Thank you, Nivea. I really appreciate your always very insightful.